This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, plus get access to our patrons-only Discord server and early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. A lot of people don't like talking about politics because they think it's too complicated. And if that's you, I don't blame you. The language of politics makes it incredibly difficult to understand what's going on. On the news, political words are very often misused or vaguely applied. Politicians identify with labels that don't describe them, and often reject the labels that do. Similar-looking words mean very different things. And to top it all off, political movements and the words they're associated with change and evolve over time. So a word that means something one day, 50 years later, might mean something else. That's the case for social democracy. If you've never heard the term before, that's probably because here in the States, we never use it. Instead, we tend to mislabel social democracy and call it socialism. Think Bernie Sanders or the Nordic countries in Europe. We know them as socialist, but according to most political textbooks and in just about every other country in the world, they're clearly understood as social democratic. There's a difference between these two things, and I'll get to why that difference matters in a second. But in case you don't watch the whole video, in just one sentence, the difference between socialism and social democracy is the relationship with capitalism that each philosophy advocates. For social democrats, capitalism is something that can be contained, reformed, or compensated for. Depending on the social democrat, capitalism is either a necessary evil or a genuinely positive economic model that simply needs to be reined in from its excesses and guided in a positive direction. In contrast, for socialists, capitalism is something that must be replaced by a fundamentally different economic model. One that is not driven by profit and in which production and distribution are organized democratically, not by wealthy and powerful individuals. The socialist goal is to transcend capitalism, while social democrats believe cleaning it up is enough. It wasn't always like this, but since at least the 1959 Godesberg program was ratified by the German Social Democratic Party, social democrats have openly rejected the idea of replacing capitalism. In practice, that means that a social democratic country has a capitalist economy, one where the vast majority of productive businesses are owned by just a few people, and profits are businesses' animating drive. This is balanced out by a robust welfare state, safety net, and/or universal public services in health and education. A few utilities and industries especially prone to monopoly may be nationalized, and sometimes even operated by the state. There is wealth redistribution from the wealthy to the poor through taxation, and generally the economy is regulated through indirect means like subsidies or taxes. These are all things that socialists give critical support to as ways to ameliorate capitalism in the short term, but that we don't consider to be nearly enough or the actual end goal. This video will explain why. If you're a social democrat, someone who supports Bernie Sanders, AOC, or looks to countries like Sweden and Denmark as models for what the US could be, odds are we see eye to eye on a lot of things. We most likely agree on social justice, our criticisms of laissez-faire capitalism, and on a number of political issues from climate change to abortion to workers' rights. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why I specifically advocate for socialism on this channel and not social democracy. It's not to be dogmatic or sectarian or to throw away pragmatism, nor is it to have a book measuring contest to see which of us is the most left-wing and call that a victory. It's because the historical record, political theory, and our present context all show that when it comes to the goals we share for a more egalitarian, just, and sustainable world, capitalism isn't something that we can rehabilitate. It always fights back. And when it's kept on a leash instead of being replaced, it always wins. In other words, social democracy is too unstable and incomplete for the results we're all looking for. First, the most basic objection that we socialists have with social democracy is that it's still capitalism. That may be obvious, but just to remind you, capitalism is an absurd economic system, where a tiny unelected minority of people get the vast majority of people to work for them so that they can get wealthier. Due to the inherent nature of capitalism, a few people own an ever-shrinking number of companies, and everyone else fights over the crumbs that fall off the table. Even in social democracies, the vast majority of people don't elect their boss. They don't have a say in the decisions that affect whether they have a job or not, and their work makes that unelected, unaccountable guy richer. For an ideology with democracy in the name, social democracy notably fails to provide democracy in the place where you spend most of your waking hours. High unionization and tripartite negotiations between the state, capitalists, and labor make that better than under a pure laissez-faire approach, but they still only balance the scales between the one guy at the top of the company and the 99 people who work there. They don't actually account for the number of people on each side the way a democracy would. They only make sure that the one guy doesn't go too far and still gets most of the money. And regardless, people in any capitalist society are bound to the profit motive. So the decisions workers make in this marginally better situation, even if they had full democratic agency, still need to produce a profit for their company and their economy. So the typical capitalist race to the bottom still applies, as everyone tries to outcompete for higher profit margins. But that's domestically, where workers' exploitation is relatively low and compensated for by a good safety net and universal amenities. Salaries in social democracies are high and public services are great. The problem with social democracy is that in order for capitalists to make good profits under this arrangement, where they pay their workers slightly better and don't get to hoard as much, somebody somewhere needs to be exploited a lot more. And that's where the global south comes in. For social democracies to provide their citizens their high standard of living and capitalists their profits, the global poor need to be taken advantage of. Let's talk about H&M for a second. H&M is a Swedish brand known for shirts that say stuff like, "My other car is Bing chilling," and shockingly, other horrible decisions. H&M is of course the second largest fashion retailer in the world, with profits in the billions of dollars. And to achieve that status, the company relies on the cheapest labor it can find. Its wealth is built on the extremely polluting fast fashion model, which is the clothing world's version of planned obsolescence. It's been found guilty of greenwashing on multiple occasions, contracts from factories that sure do seem to catch on fire a lot, and of course it doesn't pay its workers a living wage. Something it promised to do back in 2013 when people found out, but come 2018 when H&M said it would have sorted all this out, the company hit us with the classic freshman year economics, what even is a living wage? No, really, the company said there is no universally agreed level for living wages, and then it kept paying its workers like garbage. I'm using H&M as a recognizable example here, but this kind of behavior is by no means unique to this brand. The problem with social democracy is that Swedish workers would never be treated the way H&M treats its workers in the global south. But it's okay with it happening to workers employed by a Swedish company somewhere else in the world. And thanks to the fact that it does, people in Sweden get cheap clothes, and the taxes on the company back home allow the government to provide great public services. Now, this isn't different from any other capitalist country, mind you. It's not a problem unique to social democracy, and that's the point. Social democracy is built on the principles of justice and egalitarianism, but the fact that it benefits from exploitation and imperialism, particularly of this kind, shows the limits that a social democracy runs into when it agrees to follow the rules of global capitalism, which it has to. Like other capitalist countries, in order for the line to consistently go up, wealth needs to be extracted from poorer countries. If you want to learn more about that, I did a whole video on it a while back, and the Marxist Project also has a really great summary of the different ways capitalist imperialism works. But let's shift the focus back to the domestic situation. Another reason that socialists aren't social democrats is because in social democracies, the power of the capitalist class must always be catered to or society suffers the consequences. Under social democracies, progressive politics aren't gains made by the working class, but concessions granted to them by the ruling capitalist class that can be taken away at any moment. That's because, under social democracy, capital retains tremendous power, which it can use in things like capital strikes. A capital strike, like a labor strike, happens when capital refuses to work. Except capitalists don't actually work, so really a capital strike is when capitalists refuse to invest, sitting on their hands and piles of cash, and or deciding to move their capital to another country in what's called capital flight. Because social democratic societies protect the sanctity of private capital like all capitalist societies do, meaning that they are very apprehensive of expropriating capital even in times of crisis where literally one person can screw over hundreds of others, social democracies are incredibly vulnerable to backpedaling. When capitalists get a whiff of progressive social policies that could hurt their bottom line, like an upcoming set of nationalizations, minimum wage increases, a shortening of the work week, more holidays, public health care, or anything else that makes life better for everyone but makes big companies less money, capital just sits it out and sends the economy into a tailspin. Suffice it to say that governments would prefer to avoid this situation, so progressive legislation is curtailed before it's even started. And in the cases where social democratic states take the gamble and capitalists respond with a strike, social democratic governments find themselves unable to take control of the production process themselves and are forced to appease capitalists by screwing over workers and imposing austerity politics. What's great about this process from the capitalist point of view is that it happens almost automatically. In a capitalist economy, the government always has to make sure that its economy is hospitable to profit-making and therefore investment. This means that capitalists don't necessarily need to be occupying government positions or even be conscious of what they're doing. They just need to know that if the government does something they don't like, they can put their money elsewhere or stop investing. And the government knows that if it does something that lowers investments, their economy might suffer. Each actor can act with relative autonomy from one another, but because they are doing so within the same set of rules, maximizing profits for the capitalist class, they'll often naturally come to an agreement that keeping poverty around and forcing people into mind-numbing work most days of the week and most waking hours of the day is what's best for the economy. Add to that fact that capitalists can influence the government more directly by becoming elected members within it comparatively easily, financing the campaigns of people who are friendly to their interests, or owning mass media institutions that parrot their talking points, and you realize how vulnerable social democracy is by keeping capitalist power around. Not to belabor the point, but 1% of people holding the other 99% hostage by threatening to stop financing the economy when things don't go their way isn't democracy. In contrast, the socialist response of running the economy without capitalists by bringing investment into democratic hands avoids this problem domestically. Socialists still run into the problem of what to do about international capital, but this is something that can be solved by the collaboration of multiple socialist economies, so it's not insurmountable. Social democracy, however, has neither the domestic nor the international means to respond to a capitalist backlash. And this isn't just a theoretical weakness of social democracy. It's been seen in practice many times, and we're even seeing it today. Back in the 80s, for example, France elected François Mitterand to be its president. Mitterand sailed into the presidency on the promise of being a radical social democrat, bringing the mixed economy model to France with the surprising backing of the Communist Party. He did all the things I listed earlier: raised the minimum wage, nationalized a few industries, gave people more holidays and a shorter work week, raised pensions, invested in high-speed rail, all sorts of good stuff that made people's lives meaningfully better almost overnight. But just 2 years in, capital responded. Foreign and domestic investments dried up, and Mitterrand had to completely reverse course in what was called the austerity turn. Multiple nationalized industries were reprivatized, public spending on things like Social Security was massively cut, and new taxes were imposed on workers. It was a brutal blow to the French working class, and a total betrayal of the promises that Mitterrand got elected on. And Sweden's gone down the same path, just a bit more slowly and more recently. To quote a 2016 article in Forbes, just so you know I'm not using socialist sources here, over the past 2 decades, the country has undergone a transformation built on deregulation and budget self-restraint with cuts to Sweden's welfare state. Sweden's government shrank jobless and disability benefits to encourage employment. The lower benefits allowed for tax cuts. The inheritance tax was scrapped in 2005, and the wealth tax was canned 2 years later. The result? Inequality in Sweden has skyrocketed. Quoting not from Forbes this time, in 2002, Sweden's top 1% owned 18% of all household wealth. By 2017, it had risen to 42%. And, quote, the country's poorest 30% have no net wealth at all, merely net debts. This is what makes the difference between social democracy and socialism. At any given time, the economy can crumble not because of a natural disaster, a global pandemic, a sudden shortage, a war, a military coup, or a lost election, but just because things got too good for everyday people and they weren't as exploitable as before. To resist these tendencies takes tremendous political will, tremendous social engagement, and extremely high unionization. Things that can be chipped away at for years by capitalists and that can easily go out the window when the end of the month is looking lean. It's not that social democracy isn't better than what we're currently living through in the US. It undeniably is. Making the US follow the Nordic model would ease the burden on millions of people overnight. The problem is that if we ever get that, it will always contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and will demand from us that we continue to brutally exploit our fellow human beings on the other side of the world. This doesn't mean socialism is better by default. I'll let my other videos and those of other great creators on this website make the case for that. But when it comes to these problems, socialism has the answer. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that my channel is only possible thanks to my patrons on Patreon. As some of you may remember, I used to make general interest science videos. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but it was easy to get sponsors for that kind of content. When I made the switch to political content, something I actually do enjoy, most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, not many brands want to associate with anti-capitalist content, but that means I've had to rely more heavily on the generosity of viewers like you. I've got one reliable sponsor left, and it's a little nerve-wracking not to have much predictable income to count on. If you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out. We've got everything from a recommended reading list, to a book club, to countless other channels to chat, learn, and explore your interests. We've built a great little community, and we'd love for you to be part of it. So if you'd like to help keep this channel afloat and get some great perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.